The sun was beginning its descent into a fiery slumber, casting an amber glow over the tranquil lake. Peter rowed the boat with an ease that spoke of many such evenings, the oars dipping silently into the glassy water. Across from him, Jessica sat wrapped in a light shawl, her eyes reflecting the brilliant hues of the sunset. They had been talking about their dreams of traveling the world, their words weaving a tapestry of shared hopes and secret desires. As the boat glided smoothly, the world around them seemed to pause, surrendering to the intimacy of the moment. The gentle lapping of the water against the boat played a soothing melody, while the distant calls of birds bid the day farewell. It was a picture-perfect scene, one lifted from the pages of a romantic novel. Suddenly, Peter's eyes narrowed. From the shadowy shoreline, a flashlight flickered, its beam piercing through the twilight. It was as if someone was watching them, deliberately shining the light in their direction. He felt a chill snake down his spine, but when he glanced at Jessica, she was blissfully unaware, lost in her dreams of distant lands. The light blinked out, only to return moments later, more insistent this time. It felt like a silent warning, a sinister eye winking from the darkness. Peter's hands tightened around the oars. The romantic aura was slipping away, replaced by an unsettling feeling he couldn't shake off. Jessica continued to talk, her voice a melodious sound that usually calmed him. But now, her words seemed distant, muffled by the sudden pounding of his heart. He tried to focus on her, to let her enthusiasm wash over him, but the eerie occurrence on the shore had planted seeds of dread in his mind. As they neared the shore, the flashlight appeared again. This time the beam lingered on Peter, bathing him in a harsh white light. He squinted against the brightness, a sense of vulnerability washing over him. "Hey, what's the joke?" he called out, his voice tinged with a mix of annoyance and fear. The lake absorbed his words, leaving behind a suffocating silence. That's when he realized something was terribly wrong. The weight distribution in the boat had shifted. He turned, his heart thundering in his chest, only to find Jessica's spot empty. The shawl she had been wearing lay crumpled on the seat, as if she had vanished into thin air. "Jessica," Peter's voice cracked as he called out to her. The lake offered no response, just the eerie echo of his own voice. Panic clawed at him, his eyes frantically searching the dark waters and the shadowy shoreline. He rowed furiously towards the shore, each stroke fueled by a growing terror. The boat hit the land with a jarring thud. He stumbled out, his legs wobbly and uncooperative, as he called her name again and again. The silence was oppressive, suffocating, as if the night itself was holding its breath. His phone, his lifeline, was in his pocket. He fumbled with it, trying to call Jessica, but there was no answer, just the ominous, endless ringing. Suddenly, in the distance, the flashlight glowed again, its beam flickering like a malevolent eye. And then, the sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the silence, sending a wave of terror through Peter's already frayed nerves. His legs buckled and he fell to the ground, the damp earth cold against his skin. There he lay, under the uncaring gaze of the stars, his mind a whirlpool of fear and confusion. What had started as a romantic evening had spiraled into a nightmare, with every shadow seeming to conceal unspeakable horrors. As the initial shock ebbed away, he forced himself to stand, driven by a desperate need to find Jessica. But when he turned towards the parking lot, it was as if he had stepped into another world. The normalcy of it was jarring. Cars parked neatly, the occasional sound of laughter, the faint hum of the city in the distance. He approached his car, his mind numb, his body moving on autopilot, and then he froze. There, in the passenger seat, was someone sitting, their presence an incongruous blotch in the mundane setting of the parking lot. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, his heart a cacophony of dread and hope. The door creaked open, and there she was, Jessica, looking up at him with an expression of mild annoyance. "Well, finally. Where have you been?" she asked, her voice as familiar as ever. "I've been sitting here waiting for you for probably half an hour." Peter's relief was short-lived, swallowed by a tidal wave of confusion and fear. "What happened? Where did you go?" The world around Peter seemed to shift and warp as he grappled with the impossible reality before him. Jessica, sitting calmly in his car, appeared oblivious to the turmoil churning inside him. Her casual demeanor was a stark contrast to the terror that had consumed him moments ago on the lakeshore. "Jessica, I was looking for you everywhere." Peter's voice was a mix of relief and disbelief. "I thought you were... I heard a gunshot." His words tumbled out in a frantic rush. Jessica's brow furrowed slightly, a look of confusion crossing her features. "Gunshot? Peter, what are you talking about? I've been here the whole time." But Peter's mind was racing. The flashlight, the eerie silence, her sudden disappearance, and that chilling gunshot. None of it made sense. He glanced around the parking lot, half expecting to see some sign of the night's strange events, but everything appeared normal. Too normal. The air was filled with an unspoken tension as Peter started the car. The engine hummed to life, its familiar sound oddly reassuring in the midst of the surreal nightmare unfolding around him. He glanced at Jessica, searching her face for answers, but found none. As they drove away, the streets seemed alien, shadows stretching and twisting in the corners of his eyes. Every sound was amplified, every movement suspect. Peter's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with the effort to maintain control. Jessica was talking now, her voice a steady stream of words that Peter struggled to focus on. She spoke of mundane things, her day at work, a funny incident with a colleague, but her words were drowned out by the pounding of Peter's heart and the echo of that gunshot in his mind. Suddenly, without warning, the world exploded in sound. A deafening gunshot rang out, so close it felt like it was right next to Peter's ear. The shock was immediate and visceral. His vision blurred, his ears rang, and then darkness enveloped him as he lost consciousness. The silence that followed was complete and overwhelming. Time seemed to stand still, the moment stretching into an eternity. When Peter's senses slowly began to return, he could feel the hard, cold ground beneath him. His body ached, his head throbbed with a fierce intensity, and confusion clouded his mind. The memory of the gunshot hung in the air, a lingering presence that filled him with dread. He opened his eyes to a blurry, disorienting world. Shapes and colors swam before him, slowly coalescing into the familiar forms of a street, buildings, and people. Bystanders were gathered around him, their faces etched with concern and fear. Peter tried to speak, but his words were slurred and incoherent. He struggled to piece together what had happened. The car, the gunshot. Jessica. Where was Jessica? His heart raced as he frantically searched the crowd for her face, but she was nowhere to be seen. The bystanders were talking now, their voices a jumbled cacophony in his ears. He caught snatches of their conversation: an accident, a car crash, a man found unconscious on the street. It was then that Peter realized the horror of his situation. The car he had been driving, the crash, it must have happened after the gunshot. But how? And why couldn't he remember any of it? He tried to move, to get up, but his body refused to cooperate. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and unanswered questions. One thought rose above the rest, pounding in his brain with relentless urgency. Jessica. Where was Jessica? Peter's mind was a tempest of confusion and fear as he lay on the cold, hard pavement. The world around him was a blur, voices and faces merging into an indecipherable maelstrom. He tried to speak, to move, but his body was unresponsive, a prisoner of its own shock and trauma. Paramedics arrived, their urgent voices cutting through the fog in his mind. They worked swiftly, their movements precise as they assessed his condition. Peter's eyes searched frantically for Jessica, but she was nowhere to be seen amidst the sea of concerned faces and flashing lights. As the paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher, his mind raced with questions. The last thing he remembered was the gunshot, a sound so close it was as if it had erupted right beside him. What had happened after that? And where was Jessica? At the hospital. The sterile white walls and the sharp smell of antiseptics added to Peter's growing sense of unreality. Doctors and nurses flitted in and out, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Tests were conducted, questions were asked, but Peter's mind was elsewhere, trapped in the nightmare that his life had become. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Finally, a doctor approached with a somber expression. "You've been in a car accident," he explained. "You're lucky to be alive." Peter's heart sank. An accident, but how? And Jessica? Was anyone else with me? Peter's voice was a hoarse whisper, his throat dry and painful. The doctor hesitated, exchanging a glance with a nurse. "No," he said gently. "You were alone." Alone. The word echoed in Peter's mind, a cruel reminder of the night's surreal and terrifying events. He remembered Jessica in the car, her indifference to his panic, her insistence that nothing was wrong. But if she hadn't been with him, then what had happened in the boat? The flashlight, her disappearance, the gunshot. None of it made sense. Was he losing his mind? As night fell, Peter lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the evening played over and over in his head, each iteration more confusing and terrifying than the last. He needed to talk to Jessica, to understand what was happening. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone. His fingers fumbled as he dialed her number, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and desperation. The phone rang once, twice, then thrice, but there was no answer, only the cold, impersonal tone of the voicemail. Peter's heart sank. Where was she? Why wasn't she answering? A sense of dread settled over him, heavy and suffocating. The hospital room felt like a cage, the beeping of the machines a constant reminder of his fragile state. As he lay there, lost in his thoughts, a strange feeling began to creep over him. It was as if he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a chill ran down his spine. He turned his head slowly, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the soft hum of the hospital and the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor. Peter closed his eyes, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination, a side effect of the trauma and the medication. But deep down he knew that something was very wrong. The night stretched on, a long, unending tunnel of darkness and fear. And as Peter drifted in and out of fitful sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that something unseen and malevolent was watching him, waiting in the shadows. Peter's eyes flickered open to a world that felt disjointed and alien. The sterile hospital room bathed in the cold early morning light provided no comfort. His head throbbed with a relentless, pounding rhythm, echoing the chaos that swirled in his mind. The previous night's events were fragmented shards in his memory. The serene boat ride, the unsettling flashlight, Jessica's inexplicable disappearance, and the terrifying gunshot. Each memory was a puzzle piece that refused to fit. As he lay there trying to piece together the fragments, a police officer entered the room. The officer's uniform, stern and authoritative, was a stark contrast to the disarray of Peter's thoughts. "Mr. Sanders, I'm Officer Harrow. I need to ask you some questions about last night's incident." Peter's throat felt dry as he nodded, a sense of foreboding washing over him. The officer's questions were methodical, probing into the evening's events. Peter recounted everything: the boat trip, the flashlight, Jessica's disappearance, and the gunshot. But as he spoke, he could sense the officer's skepticism. "And you say Miss Jessica Turner was with you?" Officer Harrow's voice was tinged with doubt. "Yes, she was there, in the boat, then in the car." Peter's voice trailed off, his own words sounding implausible even to his ears. Officer Harrow made a note in his pad, his expression unreadable. "We found no evidence of anyone else at the scene, Mr. Sanders. Your car was the only one involved in the crash, and you were the only occupant." Peter's heart sank. The implication was clear. They didn't believe him, but he knew what he had experienced. Jessica was real, wasn't she? As the officer left, a heavy silence settled in the room. Peter's mind raced with questions. If Jessica wasn't real, then what had he experienced? Was it all a hallucination, a figment of his imagination? The day passed in a blur of doctors, nurses, and medication. Peter's sense of reality began to warp and bend. The hospital room felt like a prison, the walls closing in on him. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a whisper of something sinister. Nightfall brought no relief. As the hospital quieted down, Peter's anxiety heightened. The dim light cast eerie shadows across the room, transforming ordinary objects into grotesque figures. Lying in the darkness, Peter's mind was a battleground of fear and reason. The logical part of him wanted to dismiss everything as a result of stress and trauma. But another part, a primal, instinctive part, screamed that something otherworldly was at play. It was in these small hours of the night that Peter heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible. It was a soft, scraping noise, like something dragging itself along the floor. His heart pounded in his chest as he strained his ears, listening. The sound grew louder, closer. Peter wanted to call out, to summon help, but his voice was a prisoner in his throat. The fear was tangible, a thick, suffocating blanket that lay heavy on him. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Peter lay frozen, his eyes wide in the darkness, every sense heightened to an unbearable degree. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each second a lifetime of fear. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, Peter's terror was replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. His eyes closed, not in sleep, but in surrender to the incomprehensible nightmare his life had become. What was real? What was illusion? These questions spun in his mind as he drifted into a troubled, uneasy slumber. The events of the past night a labyrinth with no escape. Discharged from the hospital with a handful of prescriptions and a warning to rest. Peter felt anything but relieved. The world outside seemed distorted, as if he were viewing it through a broken lens. People passed by in a blur, their faces indistinct, their laughter and chatter sounding distant and hollow. He needed to see the car, the last tangible link to the night's horrors. Maybe there, amidst the twisted metal and shattered glass, he would find some clue, some evidence of Jessica's existence. The impound lot was a graveyard of broken vehicles, each with its own silent story of tragedy. Peter's car sat forlornly in a corner, a mangled wreck that was barely recognizable. His heart pounded as he approached it, a sense of dread growing with every step. The car was a testament to his miraculous survival. The front was crumpled like paper, the windshield shattered, but it was the trunk that drew Peter's attention. An irrational, nagging thought had taken root in his mind. A thought that he needed to open the trunk to see what lay inside. With trembling hands, he worked the key into the lock. The metal groaned in protest as he lifted the trunk lid. For a moment, he could only stare into the dark cavity. His breath caught in his throat, but there was nothing, no sign of Jessica, no clue to the nightmare that had enveloped his life. Just a spare tire, a jack, and a few scattered tools, mundane objects that mocked his desperate hope for answers. As he stood there, the sounds of the impound lot faded into a muffled silence. A chilling breeze whispered past him, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible scent. The scent of Jessica's perfume. Peter's heart skipped a beat. It was impossible, yet there it was, hanging in the air like a ghostly presence. He spun around, half expecting to see her standing there, but he was alone, surrounded by the wreckage of countless anonymous lives. The scent lingered for a moment longer, then dissipated, leaving Peter with a sense of loss so profound it was almost physical. The drive back to his apartment was a blur. Peter's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and despair. Was he going mad? Was Jessica a figment of his imagination, a creation of his lonely heart and stressed mind? Back in his apartment, the walls seemed to close in on him. Every creak, every shadow, seemed to hint at some hidden menace. He was a prisoner in his own home, trapped by his own fractured psyche. As night fell, the apartment grew darker, the shadows deeper. Peter sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the door. He waited for what he didn't know, for a sign, for a sound, for a glimpse of something that would give meaning to the madness. Hours passed, the clock ticking away the seconds with mechanical indifference. Then, just as Peter's eyes began to droop, a sound jolted him awake. It was a soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. His heart raced as he strained his ears, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right outside his door. Peter's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in terror. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. A heavy silence fell, oppressive and absolute. Peter sat there, his eyes wide in the darkness, every nerve stretched to breaking point. The night stretched on, an endless expanse of fear and anticipation. And as Peter sat there, alone in the darkness, he knew one thing. With absolute certainty, he was not alone. Something was out there, watching, waiting, lurking in the shadows of his own mind. The creeping dawn did little to dispel the darkness that had settled in Peter's soul. His apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum of his fractured sanity. The previous night's events had left him raw, a man teetering on the brink of madness. Unable to endure the suffocating confines of his home, Peter ventured out into the cold, uncaring light of day. The city around him was a hive of activity, a stark contrast to the desolation within him. He wandered the streets aimlessly, haunted by the memory of Jessica's perfume and the unshakable feeling of being watched. Determined to unravel the mystery, Peter decided to revisit the places where the nightmare had begun. The lake, the parking lot, any location that might offer a sliver of truth. But each place only deepened the mystery, offering no answers, only echoes of terror. In a last desperate attempt to find some semblance of reality, Peter sought out the friends and colleagues who knew Jessica. But each encounter only added to his despair. No one remembered her. It was as if she had never existed, a ghost erased from memory and time. Confused and exhausted, Peter returned to his apartment. The walls seemed to whisper secrets in the silence, secrets that he could not decipher. He pored over photographs, emails, anything that might prove Jessica's existence. But there was nothing, not a trace, not a clue. It was as if she had been a figment of his imagination, a dream that had turned into a nightmare. As night fell, a sense of dread settled over Peter. The apartment grew darker, the shadows longer. He sat there, in the dim light, waiting for something, anything, to break the oppressive silence. The hours ticked by, each one a torturous reminder of his isolation. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, a sound pierced the silence. It was a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. Peter strained his ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It was a voice, a woman's voice, soft and melodic. It was Jessica's voice. His heart pounded in his chest as he followed the sound, moving through the darkened apartment like a man possessed. The voice grew louder, clearer, leading him to the bedroom. There in the shadows stood a figure that looked like Jessica, but something was wrong. The figure was ethereal, a wisp of smoke and shadow, its edges blurred and shifting. Jessica. Peter's voice was a hoarse whisper, a mix of hope and fear. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, silent and still, a ghostly presence in the darkness. Then, with a suddenness that made Peter's blood run cold, it moved towards him. Peter stumbled back, his mind reeling in terror. The figure advanced, its form becoming more defined, more real. It was Jessica, but not as he remembered her. Her eyes were hollow, her face a mask of sorrow and pain. "Peter," the figure spoke, its voice a chilling echo of the woman he had loved. "You left me." Peter's heart ached, with a pain that was almost physical. "No, Jessica, I didn't. I tried to find you. I tried." But the figure was fading, dissolving into the shadows, leaving Peter alone in the darkness. The night passed in a haze of fear and confusion. Peter sat there, in the silent apartment, grappling with the reality of what he had seen. Was it a hallucination, a product of his grief-stricken mind, or had Jessica's spirit truly visited him, a specter from beyond the grave? As dawn broke, Peter knew one thing for certain: he was no closer to the truth. The mystery of Jessica's existence and her disappearance remained unsolved, a puzzle that threatened to consume him. And as the light of a new day filtered through the blinds, Peter sat there, a man lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, searching for a truth that seemed forever out of reach. Determined to confront the nightmare head-on, Peter set out into the cold morning. The city, with its bustling indifference, seemed like a cruel joke to his tormented mind. He retraced his steps, visiting the lake, the park, the impound lot, desperately searching for anything he might have missed. But each place was a dead end, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. In a last desperate bid for answers, Peter visited a medium, a woman reputed to be able to communicate with the other side. Her shop was a small, cluttered space, filled with the scent of incense and the whisper of unseen presences. The medium, a gaunt woman with piercing eyes, listened to Peter's story with a disquieting intensity. As she began her seance, the air grew thick, charged with a palpable tension. The medium's voice rose and fell in a hypnotic cadence, calling out to the spirits, and then she spoke a name: Jessica. Peter's heart leaped in his chest. The medium's eyes rolled back, her voice becoming a conduit for something else, something otherworldly. "Peter?" The voice was Jessica's, but it was laced with a cold, hollow tone. "Why did you let me go?" Tears streamed down Peter's face. "I didn't, Jessica. I tried to find you. Please, tell me what happened." The medium's body shivered, the air around her shimmering with a spectral energy. "The lake," the voice whispered. "You left me at the lake. You let me slip away into the darkness." The revelation hit Peter like a physical blow. The lake, the night of the boating trip. Had something happened that he had repressed, a memory so traumatic that his mind refused to acknowledge it? He left the medium's shop in a daze, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The lake. He had to return to the lake. It was there that this nightmare had begun, and it was there that he would find his answers. As he stood on the shore, the memories came rushing back in a torrential flood. Jessica laughing and smiling in the boat, the flickering flashlight from the shore, the argument, a bitter, angry exchange that had turned violent. In a moment of blind rage, Peter had pushed her, watched her fall into the inky waters. The memory was a jagged shard in his heart, a brutal truth that tore through the fabric of his reality. It had been him all along. He had let Jessica slip away into the darkness of the lake, her body lost to its depths. The rest had been a delusion. His mind's desperate attempt to shield him from the horrific truth of his actions. As the realization settled over him, a new sound pierced the morning air, the wail of police sirens. Someone had found Jessica's body, and Peter's fragmented confession to the medium had led them to him. The officers approached, their faces grim. Peter didn't resist as they handcuffed him, his gaze fixed on the placid waters of the lake. There, in its depths, lay the end of his nightmare, the final, harrowing conclusion to a story that had begun as a romantic idyll and ended in madness and murder. As they led him away, Peter's mind was a shattered mirror reflecting the fragments of a truth too terrible to bear. The lake, a silent witness to his crime, rippled gently in the morning breeze, its secrets forever entombed in its dark, cold heart.